Picture this. It is January 1904. The air is so cold it snaps like a dry twig. The St. Lawrence River, usually a roaring artery of commerce and power, is frozen solid, a ribbon of white, thick ice winding through the Thousand Islands on the border of New York and Canada. Silence hangs over the river, the kind of heavy, oppressive silence that only deep winter can bring. But on one specific island, a silhouette breaks the emptiness. A structure rises against the gray sky that defies all logic. Not a house, not a mansion, not a summer cottage, a full-scale Rhineland fortress. Let that image settle in your mind. We aren't talking about a wood-frame Victorian home with a nice porch. We're talking about 6 stories of solid granite, a monolith, a castle that looks as if it had been ripped straight from the cliffs of the Rhine River in medieval Germany and dropped inexplicably onto a tiny rock in North America. 120 rooms, 6 floors, tunnels, towers, turrets, rising from the frozen water like a stone hallucination. To the locals shivering on the mainland in Alexandria Bay, it must have looked like magic or madness. To understand the scale of this insanity, you have to look at the numbers. And the numbers are staggering. The foundation alone required the island to be physically reshaped. The granite was quarried from Oak Island, hauled across the water on barges that groaned under the weight. The sandstone details were brought from Potsdam. Thousands of tons of masonry, not built on the bedrock of Manhattan, not built on the sprawling estates of Newport, built in the middle of a river. If you were to stand at the base of it in 1904, looking up at the slate roof, you would feel small, insignificant. This wasn't shelter. This was a statement. This was an exclamation point made of a stone. But a castle is just a pile of rocks without a king. And the king of this particular fairy tale was a man named George C. Boldt. George Boldt. The name meant something then. It meant everything. But he wasn't like the Vanderbilts. He wasn't like the Astors. He wasn't born into American royalty with a silver spoon in his mouth and a trust fund in his pocket. No, George Boldt was a Prussian immigrant. He arrived in America in the 1860s, a teenager with practically nothing but the clothes on his back and a terrifying work ethic. He started at the bottom, the absolute bottom, washing dishes in humid, crowded kitchens, clearing tables, the invisible labor that the Gilded Age was built upon. But George didn't stay invisible. He had a genius for people, a genius for service. While the robber barons were obsessed with steel and oil and railroads, cold, hard commodities, George Boldt understood something softer yet equally profitable. He understood hospitality. He climbed the ladder, rung by bruised rung, until he wasn't just working in hotels, he was defining them. By the turn of the century, George Boldt was the proprietor of the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. And let's be clear about what the Waldorf Astoria was. It wasn't just a hotel. It was the hotel. It was the center of the universe for the American elite. If you were anyone, you stayed at the Waldorf. If you were no one, you stood outside and watched who went in. Boldt presided over this empire like a benevolent dictator. He was the man who practically invented the concept of the customer is always right. He introduced room service. He made the velvet rope famous. He was the prince of hospitality, a man who could anticipate a guest's desire before the guest even knew they had it. He was rich, fabulous, unimaginable wealth, the kind of wealth that comes from taking a 13-story hotel and turning it into a gold mine. He moved in the same circles as the men who built Biltmore, but he moved with a different swagger. He was self-made. He had scrubbed the floors he now owned, and because of that, perhaps, he didn't feel the need to build a house to impress his rivals. He didn't care about outdoing the neighbors in Newport. He didn't care about social climbing. He had already climbed the mountain and planted his flag. So why build a Rhineland castle on a remote island in upstate New York? Why drag 300 stonemasons, carpenters, and artists to the Canadian border? Love. It sounds cliché. It sounds like a paperback romance novel. But for George Boldt, it was the absolute unvarnished truth. He was madly, deeply, obsessively in love with his wife, Louise. Louise Carrer. She was the daughter of the man who gave George his first real break in the kitchen. She had been with him since the beginning, before the millions, before the Waldorf, before the fame. She was his partner, his confidant, his anchor. In a world of arranged marriages and strategic alliances among the wealthy, George and Louise had something rare. They actually liked each other. They were inseparable. And as George's fortune swelled to astronomical proportions, he began to look for a way to express that devotion. A diamond necklace wasn't enough. A trip to Paris wasn't enough. He needed something permanent, something eternal. He decided to build her a monument. In the mid-1890s, the Boldts began spending their summers in the Thousand Islands. It was a playground for the rich, yes, but it was also wilder, freer than the stuffy ballrooms of Fifth Avenue. George fell in love with the river, the clear water, the fishing, the air, and he found a specific island. It was called Hart Island, spelled H-A-R-T, a stag, a deer. To anyone else, it was just a name. To George Boldt, it was a typo. He bought the island, and then, in a move that signals the sheer scale of his obsession, he decided to fix the geography. He didn't just rename it, he reshaped it. Picture the audacity. He hired engineers to blast the shoreline with explosives. He built sea walls. He dredged the river bottom. He physically altered the contours of the land until, if you looked at it from the heavens, the island resembled a heart. He renamed it Hart Island, H-E-A-R-T. And then he began to build. He didn't want a summer home. He wanted a fantasy. He wanted to give Louise a fairy tale solidified in granite. The architectural style wasn't chosen because it was trendy. It was chosen because it was romantic. It was chosen to evoke the legends of Europe, the castles of kings and queens. He hired the architectural firm of G.W. and W.D. Hewitt and essentially gave them a blank check. The budget? Unlimited. The deadline? Valentine's Day. The goal was simple, yet impossible. He planned to present the completed castle to Louise on February 14th, 1904, the ultimate Valentine. The construction site became a hive of activity that the region had never seen before and has never seen since. 300 men. An army? They descended on the island. Imagine the noise, the constant clinking of chisels on stone, echoing across the water from dawn until dusk, the shouting of foremen, the chugging of steam engines hoisting massive beams into the sky. This wasn't building on solid ground near a railroad depot. This was building a skyscraper's worth of material in the middle of a flowing river. Everything, every bag of cement, every nail, every pane of glass, every slab of marble had to be put on a boat and floated over. In winter, when the river froze, they built sleds and dragged materials across the ice. It was a logistical nightmare. It was dangerous. It was expensive. And George Boldt didn't care. He built a powerhouse first. Not a shed for a generator, but a medieval tower in its own right, with an arched stone bridge, designed to hold the steam engines and dynamos that would electrify the castle. It was beautiful, and it was just the utility building. He built the Ulster Tower. This was the playhouse, a weird, eclectic, lopsided tower inspired by a defense tower in Hamburg, Germany. It looked like a ruin before it was even finished. It had a bowling alley, it had a theater, it was a place for guests to stay while the main castle was rising next door. And the main castle? It grew, floor by floor, 6 stories of opulence. The ground floor was designed for entertaining, with a ballroom, a billiard room, a reception room that could hold hundreds. The main staircase was a masterpiece of marble and wrought iron, spiraling up toward a stained glass dome that would flood the interior with colored light. George spared no expense. He imported Italian marble for the mantels. He brought in artists to carve intricate oak paneling. He ordered tapestries from France. He planned for an indoor swimming pool. He planned for an elevator in 1900, an elevator in a private home on an island. The locals watched in awe. They called it Boldt's Folly in hushed tones, but they couldn't look away. It was the American dream writ large, but scrawled across the landscape in a stone. It was a testament to what a man could do if he had enough money and enough love. By January 1904, the exterior was largely complete. The shell of the dream was there. The towers pierced the clouds. The slate roof was finished. The windows were being installed to seal the structure against the biting winter wind. Inside, the craftsmen were working feverishly on the details, the plasterwork, the mosaics, the intricate wood carvings that George knew Louise would adore. Imagine George Boldt in those final months, standing on the dock of Hart Island, wrapped in a heavy fur coat, his breath steaming in the cold air, looking up at the fortress he had conjured from nothing. He must have felt invincible. He had conquered poverty. He had conquered New York society. And now he had conquered nature itself, turning a rock in the river into a palace for his queen. He was the prince of hospitality, preparing the ultimate suite for the ultimate guest. The plan was set. On Valentine's Day, he would bring Louise to the island. They would walk through the massive oak doors. He would show her the ballroom where they would dance. He would show her the library where they would read. He would hand her the keys to the castle. It was going to be the crowning moment of his life, a triumph of romance over reality. But life, unlike architecture, cannot be engineered. You can blast the shoreline into the shape of a heart, but you cannot reinforce the heart that beats inside a human chest. You can build walls of solid granite to keep out the wind and the cold, but you cannot build walls high enough to keep out tragedy. It is early 1904. The castle is 95% complete. The furniture is in crates, waiting to be unpacked. The tapestries are rolled up, ready to be hung. The steam engines in the powerhouse are ready to hum to life. The workers are putting the final polish on the marble floors. The anticipation is electric. George is in New York at the Waldorf, managing his empire, counting down the days until the reveal. He is checking the weather reports for upstate. He is organizing the train that will take them north. He is a man at the absolute peak of his power, holding the world in the palm of his hand. And then a telegram arrives, a thin piece of paper, a few typed words. It wasn't a bill. It wasn't a business contract. It was a message from the doctors attending to Louise. She was sick, not just a winter cold, not just a passing fever. It was serious. George dropped everything, the hotel, the meetings, the millions. He rushed to her side. For a man who could fix anything, who could build anything, who could command armies of workers to move mountains, this was the one thing he could not control. The silence of the narrative shifts here. We move from the roaring noise of construction, the clatter of the Gilded Age, to the hush of a sick room. The man who built a fortress for his love was now watching that love fade away. Boldt Castle stands on Hart Island today, grand and imposing. But to understand it, you have to understand that it is not a house, it is a tombstone. It is a memorial to a moment that never happened, a Valentine that was never delivered, because Louise never saw the castle completed. In January 1904, just weeks before the grand unveiling, Louise Boldt died. She was 41 years old, and in that moment, the dream died with her. George Boldt was shattered. The man who had risen from the scullery to the penthouse, the man who had reshaped the earth, was broken. He didn't just grieve, he stopped. He sent a telegram to the island. Imagine the scene. The foreman receives the message. He reads it. He looks up at the 300 men working on the scaffolds, the men carving the wood, the men laying the tile. The order was simple. Stop. Not slow down, not take a break. Stop. Stop all work. George Boldt commanded the workers to lay down their tools immediately. He didn't want the building finished. He didn't want to sell it. He didn't want to see it. He couldn't bear the thought of this massive stone declaration of love existing without the woman it was meant for. The hammers stopped ringing. The steam engines were powered down. The chisels were placed on benches. The silence returned to Hart Island, and George Boldt never returned. He never set foot on the island again. He walked away from millions of dollars of investment. He walked away from the granite, the marble, the imported tapestries. He left it all to the wind and the rain and the winter snow. For 73 years, the castle sat empty. Let that sink in. 73 years. While the world changed around it, while the Titanic sank, while World War I raged, while the Roaring Twenties boomed and crashed into the Great Depression, while World War II burned across Europe, while men walked on the moon. Boldt Castle stood in the middle of the St. Lawrence River, a hollow shell. The winters were cruel. The wind tore off the roof shingles. The rain seeped into the unfinished rooms, rotting the magnificent oak staircases. Vandals broke in and scribbled their names on the walls where George had planned to hang masterpieces. The plaster crumbled. The iron rusted. The island became overgrown, nature reclaiming the heart that George had carved out. It became a ghost story, a place where teenagers dared each other to sneak in at night, a dark, looming silhouette against the moon. The impossible Valentine became a ruin of the Gilded Age. Most mansions from that era met the wrecking ball. They were too expensive to maintain, too gaudy for modern tastes. They were torn down to make way for subdivisions or strip malls. But Boldt Castle survived. Why? Because it was built too well to fall down and it was too remote to be worth demolishing. It sat there, a stubborn, stone refusal to disappear. It stood as a testament to the fragility of life and the endurance of love, or perhaps the endurance of pain. But this isn't just a story about a ruin, it's a story about a resurrection, because something happened in 1977 that changed everything. The Thousand Islands Bridge Authority acquired the property for nothing. The descendants of George Boldt essentially gave it away on the condition that any revenue generated would go back into restoring the castle. Not to finish it, George never wanted it finished, but to preserve it. to stop the decay. And so, we look at Boldt Castle today. We see the gold leaf restored on the ceilings. We see the stained glass shining in the sun. We see the gardens blooming. But we must never forget the silence of 1904. We must never forget the image of those 300 workers laying down their tools and walking away, leaving a palace to freeze in time. Boldt Castle is more than architecture. It is an emotional landscape. It is the joy of a young immigrant boy making good. It is the arrogance of a tycoon reshaping the world. And it is the crushing, absolute despair of a husband losing his wife. When you walk through the halls today, you aren't just walking through a building. You are walking through George Boldt's broken heart. But to really understand the castle, we have to look closer at the details. We have to look at the yacht house. We have to look at the tunnels. We have to look at the strange occult symbols carved into the woodwork. Because George didn't just build a home, he built a code, a mystery. The yacht house alone is bigger than most mansions. It sits on a separate island, Wellesley Island, just across the water. It was designed to house the Boldt family's fleet of boats, and they were a fleet: steam yachts, racing boats, houseboats. The yacht house has slips 128 feet long. The doors are so tall that the masts of sailing ships could pass through without being lowered. It also included quarters for the crew, a shop for repairs, and a towering spire that rivaled the castle itself. Why? Because in the Thousand Islands, the river was the road, and George Boldt wanted to travel in style. But let's go back to the main island, Hart Island. Let's talk about the Ulster Tower again, the playhouse. Historians still argue about it. It doesn't fit. The main castle is Rhineland style, formal, imposing. The Ulster Tower is weird. It's asymmetrical. The stairs are uneven. The rooms are odd shapes. Some say it was built without blueprints, that George Boldt improvised it on the spot, directing the masons like a conductor directing an orchestra. Put a window here. Build a turret there. It feels organic, almost like it grew out of the ground. It was here, in the Ulster Tower, that the family actually lived during the construction. This is where the memories were made. This is where Louise laughed. This is where the tragedy feels most potent. Because while the big castle was the dream, the Ulster Tower was the reality. It was the home they actually shared. And then there are the tunnels. Beneath the island, a network of tunnels connects the buildings. Service tunnels? Yes. But also tunnels for the family so they could move between the buildings without facing the elements. Imagine the cost of digging through solid granite under the water table to create these passageways. It speaks to a desire for control, a desire to create a self-contained world where the weather didn't matter, where the outside world couldn't get in. A fortress, a sanctuary. Boldt Castle was designed to be a paradise, a utopia for two. It had its own power plant. It had its own water system. It had huge gardens to provide fresh flowers every day. It had a hennery to provide fresh eggs. It was a city unto itself. George Boldt was building a kingdom where Louise would be the eternal queen. But kingdoms fall, and kings are mortal. The tragedy of Boldt Castle is that it stands as a monument to almost. It is the most beautiful almost in the world, almost finished, almost lived in, almost perfect. In the next part, we are going to dive into the resurrection. We are going to look at how this rotting shell was brought back from the brink of collapse. We are going to look at the mysteries hidden inside the walls, the secret passages, the graffiti left by soldiers, and the architectural oddities that still baffle experts today. And we will ask the question, can a building have a soul? Because if you ask anyone who has spent a winter night on Hart Island, when the wind howls through the towers and the river ice cracks in the darkness, they will tell you the same thing. Boldt Castle is not empty. But first, we have to understand the decay. We have to understand the 73 years of silence, because that is where the real story lies. Not in the gold leaf, but in the rot. Picture it. 1920. The windows are broken. Snow drifts into the ballroom. Birds nest in the chandeliers. The Gilded Age is over. The Jazz Age is roaring. But on Hart Island, time has stopped. The customer is always right man has left the building, and the building is waiting for a guest who will never arrive. This is the story of Boldt Castle, and we are just getting started. Picture the scene. It is not New York City, where the steel girders can be trucked in from the foundries of Pennsylvania on paved roads. It is not Chicago, where a labor force of thousands is just a whistle blow away. This is the St. Lawrence River, the borderland, a place of violent currents, sudden storms, and winters that turn the world into a sheet of brutal, unyielding white. And right in the middle of this aquatic wilderness, George Boldt decides to build a city. Calling Boldt Castle a summer home is an insult to the English language. It is like calling the pyramids a tombstone. It is a gross simplification of a logistical miracle, because before a single tapestry could be hung, before a single chandelier could be lit, Boldt had to solve a problem that would have broken a lesser man. He had to conquer the river. Let that sink in. Every single brick, every sack of cement, every slab of granite, every steel beam, every pane of glass, it all had to float. There were no bridges to Hart Island. There are no bridges today. Everything you see standing there, millions of pounds of material, had to be barged across treacherous water. And when the water turned to ice, when the river froze solid in the deep freeze of January, most construction projects would shut down. They would pack up. They would wait for the thaw, not Boldt. For George Boldt, the ice wasn't an obstacle. It was a highway. He hired teams of horses and sleds. They dragged materials across the frozen river, risking cracks in the ice, risking the horses, risking everything to keep the schedule. Why? Because this wasn't just a construction site. It was a crusade, a race against time to deliver the ultimate Valentine. And what he was building wasn't just a house. It was a self-sustaining kingdom. To understand the scale of Boldt Castle, you have to look away from the castle itself. You have to look at the support structures. In any other estate, the generator shed is a shack hidden behind some bushes, a utility closet. But on Hart Island, Boldt built the powerhouse. If you sail past it today, you might mistake the powerhouse for the castle itself. It stands on the eastern tip of the island, rising out of the water like a medieval fortress. Stone arches, a soaring clock tower that chimes across the waves, turrets, battlements. It is breathtakingly beautiful. And its entire purpose, its sole reason for existing, was to hold 2 steam engine generators. That's it. A cathedral built for coal. Inside, it was a marvel of modern engineering masked in old world charm. Boldt wasn't just bringing luxury to the islands, he was bringing the 20th century. He wired the island for direct current electricity at a time when most of rural America was still lighting kerosene lamps. He built and arched a stone bridge connecting the powerhouse to the main island, a bridge that looks like it belongs in a fairy tale purely to carry wires and pipes. But the powerhouse was just the battery. The playground was the Ulster Tower. This is where things get strange. This is where we see the whimsy in the man. The main castle is symmetrical, rigid, formal. The Ulster Tower is chaos. It sits on the water's edge facing the main shipping channel, a bizarre, uneven, lopsided confection of a stone that looks like a defense fortification from the Rhineland. Some say Boldt sketched the design himself on the back of an envelope. Some say it was modeled after a tower he saw in Hamburg. It was the playhouse, but again, the word feels too small. It contained a professional regulation bowling alley. It had a stage for theatrical performances. It had a library. It had a shell room designed with a curvature to amplify the sound of the water lapping against the foundation, creating a natural, acoustic serenity. It was a man cave the size of a municipal library. While the main castle was being built, the Boldt family lived here in the Ulster Tower. It was the practice run, the prototype, and it was here, amidst the dust and the noise of construction, that they spent their happiest summers. And then there was the yacht house. You cannot talk about the Thousand Islands without talking about boats. And George Boldt, the man who ran the Waldorf Astoria, wasn't going to park his fleet in a wooden shed. He crossed the water to Wellesley Island, directly opposite the castle, and built a garage for giants. The Boldt Yacht House is staggering. The doors are tall enough to admit a sailing ship with its masts fully rigged. We are talking about a building that is 128 feet tall. The main slip is 128 feet long. It was designed to house the La Duchesse, a houseboat that was essentially a floating hotel, and the PDQU, a racing launch that tore up the river. The yacht house had living quarters for the crew that were nicer than most middle-class homes. It had repair shops. It had a smoking room. It was larger than most hotels in the region, and it was just the parking lot. But let's cross the water back to the main event, the castle, rising 6 stories above the bedrock, 120 rooms, modeled after the romantic castles of the Rhine, but built with the muscular arrogance of American steel and granite. The foundation isn't just sitting on the island, it is fused to it. The granite for the exterior was quarried from nearby Oak Island, ensuring that the castle literally sprang from the same geological DNA as the river itself. But the details? The details were global. Sandstone trim imported from Potsdam, New York. Terracotta roofing tiles. Italian marble. There are tunnels, actual subterranean tunnels, blasted through the solid granite bedrock beneath the island. Why? So that supplies could be moved from the docks to the castle without spoiling the view. So that servants could move unseen, appearing only when needed, like magic. It was the same philosophy he used at the Waldorf. The service must be invisible. The magic must be effortless. Inside the main hall, the numbers turn into poetry. A central rotunda topped with a stained glass dome that filtered the sunlight into a kaleidoscope of amber and gold. A ballroom where the music would never end. An indoor swimming pool, heated of course, lined with mosaic tiles. Elevators. Not dumbwaiters, but passenger elevators. A rarity in private homes of 1903. Think about the heating system. Boldt wasn't building a summer cottage. He was building a year-round residence. He installed massive boilers, a labyrinth of pipes to pump steam heat into every corner of those 120 rooms. He wanted to be able to stand in his tower in the dead of February, watch the snow fall on the frozen river, and feel the warmth of civilization against his back. He was building the Biltmore of the North. George Vanderbilt spent $6 million. George Boldt was on track to spend $2.5 million, about $85 million today, but the degree of difficulty was arguably higher. Vanderbilt had a train line. Boldt had barges and ice sleds. Vanderbilt had land. Boldt had a rock in the middle of a current. And by the winter of 1903, turning into 1904, the impossible was almost finished. Imagine the atmosphere on Hart Island in January 1904. It is freezing. The wind howls down the river channel, cutting through coats and gloves, but the island is hot with activity. 300 workers are pushing day and night. Stonemasons, wood carvers, electricians, plasterers. The air is filled with the sounds of hammers ringing against steel, the shout of foremen, the hiss of steam engines. The structure is done. The roof is on. The scaffolding is coming down to reveal the silhouette that Boldt had dreamed of for years. The heart was beating. Down on the docks, the crates were piling up. This is the part that breaks your heart when you look back on it. The crates were full. They held the finishings, imported Italian marble statues, carved specifically for the niches in the hallway, tapestries from France woven with scenes of romance and chivalry, oriental rugs rolled tight, waiting to be unfurled on the oak floors, fine china, silverware, crystal chandeliers that would shatter the darkness with electric light. The table was literally being set. George Boldt had a specific date in mind, Valentine's Day, 1904. It was his target. It was his holy grail. This wasn't just a holiday. It was the deadline for the greatest romantic gesture in American history. He wasn't just giving his wife a card. He was giving her a kingdom. He was giving Louise, the love of his life, the mother of his children, the partner in his rise to glory, a monument that would carry her name forever. The workers knew the deadline. They were working double shifts. The interior woodwork was being polished. The grand staircase, a cascading waterfall of wood and craftsmanship, was ready for her footsteps. The elevator gears were greased. The water was ready to flow. It is difficult to overstate how close they were. This wasn't a project abandoned in the early stages. This wasn't a foundation pit left to fill with rain. This was a home. It was 95% complete. The skin was on. The bones were set. The heart was ready to start pumping. George Boldt was 52 years old. He was at the absolute apex of his power. He was the most famous hotelier in the world. He was rich beyond avarice. He had the perfect family. He had the perfect location. And in a few weeks, on February 14th, he would hand the keys to Louise and say, "This is for you." The anticipation must have been intoxicating. You can imagine him walking through the silent, unfinished ballroom, visualizing the party, seeing the guests arriving by steam launch, seeing the lights reflecting on the water, seeing Louise descending that staircase, the Queen of the St. Lawrence. The dream was real. It was physical. You could touch it. You could smell the sawdust and the fresh paint. It was happening. But history, as it so often does, was holding a different set of cards. While the hammers rang out on the island, a telegram was traveling through the wires. A message that would travel faster than the barges, cut deeper than the cold wind, and stop the heartbeat of the island in a single devastating second. The customer is always right. That was Boldt's motto. He could fix anything. If a guest needed a specific type of pillow, he found it. If a king needed a banquet, he cooked it. He was the master of outcomes. He was the man who could control the environment. But there are things that even the richest man in America cannot control. There are storms you cannot build a break wall against. And as January faded into February, just days before the grand unveiling, the silence was coming. Not the silence of a finished library, but the silence of a tomb. We are standing on the precipice of the tragedy. The house is built. The stage is set. The actors are in place, and the curtain is about to fall. It happens in a heartbeat. Sometimes history doesn't turn on a dime. Sometimes it snaps like a dry twig in a winter storm. January 1904, the Thousand Islands are locked in ice. The St. Lawrence River, usually a blue artery of commerce and leisure, is a sheet of white iron. The wind is howling around the granite towers of Hart Island, whistling through the scaffolding that still clings to the sides of the castle like a wooden exoskeleton. Inside, the air is thick with the dust of plaster and the smell of sawdust. 300 men are working. It is a symphony of construction. The rhythmic thud of hammers, the screech of saws cutting through imported oak, the clinking of trowels against Italian marble, they are in the final sprint. The deadline is February 14th, Valentine's Day, George Boldt's deadline, the day he intends to hand the keys to the love of his life, Louise. The house is 95% complete. Let that sink in. 95%. The crates of furniture are already on the docks. The silverware is packed. The tapestries are ready to be hung. The dream is not on the horizon. The dream is in the room. You can touch it. And then a boat cuts through the ice, or perhaps a messenger crosses the frozen river on foot. We don't know the exact mechanics of the delivery, but we know what arrived. A telegram, a yellow slip of paper, a handful of words printed in a stark, mechanical ink. The foreman opens it in the site office. He reads it. He reads it again, and the blood drains from his face. The message is from George Boldt, and it contains the most devastating news a husband can convey, and the most confusing order a builder can receive. Louise Boldt is dead, 41 years old, a sudden heart failure, gone, just like that. The woman for whom the island was reshaped, for whom the granite was quarried, for whom the tunnels were dug, has ceased to exist. And the order that followed was not a slow down. It was not take a break. It was not finish the roof and then we'll see. The order was stop all work. Stop. Imagine that moment. The foreman walks out into the great hall. He blows a whistle, or perhaps he just raises his hands, and the noise dies. The hammers stop mid-swing. The saws spin down to silence. The masons lowered their trowels. The silence that fell over Hart Island in January 1904 was heavier than the granite blocks they were lifting. And here is where the story shifts from a fairy tale into a ghost story. Because they didn't just stop working, they left. The workers, 300 of them, put down their tools. They didn't pack them up. They didn't clean the site. They simply walked away. Hammers were left on workbenches. Bags of plaster were left open, exposing the powder to the air. Crates of Italian marble, worth thousands of dollars, worth a fortune in today's money, were left on the dock unopened. They walked across the ice off the island and they never came back. George Boldt, the man who commanded armies of waiters, the man who built the Waldorf Astoria, the man who changed the skyline of New York City, was broken. He never set foot on Hart Island again, not once. He lived for another 12 years, continuing to run his empire, continuing to be a titan of industry, but he could not bear to look at the stone manifestation of his grief. For him, the castle wasn't a house, it was a tombstone, a 6-story, 120-room headstone for a love that ended too soon. And so, the silence stretched out, not for a week, not for a month, but for 73 years. Picture this, 73 years of abandonment. The castle became the property of the wind and the rain, and the St. Lawrence River is not a gentle landlord. The winters here are brutal. Temperatures drop to 20-30 degrees below zero. Ice storms coat the trees in crystal armor. Without a heating system, without maintenance, the castle began to die. The roof, unfinished in places, began to leak. Water, the universal solvent, trickled down into the grand ballroom. It soaked into the subfloors. It crept behind the plaster. The freeze-thaw cycle began its slow, grinding work. Water would seep into a crack in the marble during the day, freeze at night, expand, and snap. The marble would shatter. For decades, Boldt Castle was the ultimate haunted house. It became a legend for local teenagers, a destination for vandals, a curiosity for boaters who would drift past and stare at the empty, gaping windows. The degradation was absolute. Vandals broke in. They didn't just look around, they destroyed. They smashed the imported terracotta roof tiles just to hear the sound of them breaking. They threw stones through the stained glass dome that was meant to illuminate the grand staircase. That dome, a masterpiece of colored glass, lay in shards on the floor, covered in decades of pigeon droppings and dead leaves. They stripped the walls. The rare wood paneling was ripped out and burned for campfires on the marble floors. Can you imagine that? Burning priceless, hand-carved oak on a floor meant for a Gilded Age queen just to stay warm for a night of drinking? Graffiti covered everything. John Loves Mary, 1956. The class of '64 was here. Crude drawings, names, dates, obscenities scrawled over the plaster walls where silk tapestries were supposed to hang. The basement became a swimming pool of murky, stagnant rainwater. The tunnels, where the servants were meant to scurry unseen, became the homes of rats and bats. The Ulster Tower, that whimsical playhouse we talked about, began to crumble, its structural integrity failing as the years chewed away at the mortar. It was a modern ruin, an American Parthenon, rotting in the middle of a river. Nature began to reclaim the island. Vines grew up the sides of the powerhouse, strangling the stonework. Saplings took root on the balconies, their roots driving wedges between the granite blocks. The heart-shaped island was suffering from heart failure. By the 1970s, the castle was on the verge of collapse. It was no longer romantic, it was dangerous. There was talk of tearing it down. Can you imagine the sheer waste? Demolishing a structure that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to replicate today, simply because it had been forgotten? But then, in 1977, something miraculous happened. A second turning point. The Thousand Islands Bridge Authority, a quasi-governmental agency that operates the bridges connecting New York and Canada, stepped in. They looked at this rotting carcass of a dream and saw something worth saving. They acquired the property from the Boldt family estate. And the price? $1. Let me repeat that. $1. You couldn't buy a pack of gum for $1 today. You couldn't buy a newspaper. But for a single dollar note, the Bridge Authority bought an island, a yacht house, a powerhouse, and a 120-room castle. But as with all things in life, there was a catch. There is always a catch. The deed stipulated that all revenues generated from the castle, every ticket sold, every postcard bought, every penny, must be put back into the restoration and preservation of the property. It could never be used for profit. It had to be a labor of love. And so the work began. But the philosophy of the restoration is fascinating, and it makes Boldt Castle unique among all the great mansions of America. Unlike the Biltmore, which is a pristine time capsule of what life was like, Boldt Castle is a monument to what life could have been. The bridge authority decided not to finish the castle in the sense of making it a modern hotel or a fully realized home as George Boldt might have done in 1904. They decided to stabilize and restore. They stopped the leaks. They fixed the roof. They cleared the tons of debris. They scrubbed the graffiti, though if you look closely in some of the unfinished rooms on the upper floors, they left some of it. They left the names scrawled in 1945 and 1962. Why? Because the 73 years of silence are part of the story too. The abandonment is as much a part of the history as the construction. When you visit Boldt Castle today, you are walking through a strange, suspended reality. The ground floor has been beautifully restored. The grand staircase, once a skeletal wreck, has been returned to its glory. The marble glows. The stained glass dome has been painstakingly recreated, piece by piece, illuminating the hall with amber and violet light. You can stand there and feel the oppression of the wealth, the sheer weight of the luxury, but then you climb the stairs. You go to the third floor, the fourth floor, and suddenly the illusion drops away. You step into rooms that are naked. You see the wooden studs. You see the backside of the lath and plaster. You see the steel beams that George Boldt, ever the innovator, used to support the structure, technology that was cutting edge in 1900. You see the pencil marks of the original carpenters on the wood, measurements scribbled in 1903, instructions left for workers who went to lunch and never came back. It is haunting. There is a profound sadness in an unfinished room. A finished room has a purpose. It has a history of use. An unfinished room is pure potential that was suffocated. It is a sentence that stops in the middle of a word. You walk through the bedrooms meant for the children, Clover and George Jr. You see the views of the river they were supposed to wake up to, but they never slept there. They never watched the sunrise from those windows. You walk into the suite intended for Louise. It is fit for royalty, but her reflection never graced the mirrors. Her footsteps never crossed the threshold. This is the power of Boldt Castle. It is not just a display of money, it is a display of fragility. We look at the Gilded Age titans, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Boldt, and we see them as invincible. They moved mountains, they bought governments, they built monuments that dwarfed the cathedrals of Europe. They seem to have conquered the world. But George Boldt could not conquer death. All his money, all his millions, all his Italian marble and German engineering could not buy one more heartbeat for the woman he loved. And when she died, the money became meaningless. The stone became meaningless. Biltmore in North Carolina stands as a testament to legacy. It is a house that was lived in, loved, passed down through generations. It is a triumph of dynasty. Boldt Castle stands as a testament to heartbreak. It is a triumph of nothing but sorrow. Today, millions of dollars have been poured back into the castle. The yacht house across the water holds the remnants of a glorious fleet. The gardens are manicured to perfection, blooming with thousands of flowers that Louise never saw. The Ulster Tower is being shored up. Tourists flock there by the boatload. They eat ice cream on the docks. They take selfies in the ballroom. They marvel at the architecture. But if you can, try to find a quiet corner. Maybe on a rainy Tuesday. Maybe late in the afternoon when the crowds thin out. Stand on the terrace, looking out toward the St. Lawrence River. Feel the cold wind coming off the water. Close your eyes, you can almost hear it. Not the sound of the tourists, not the sound of the tour boat engines, but the sound of that day in January 1904, the sound of a whistle blowing, the sound of a hammer being set down on a workbench, the sound of footsteps walking away, and then silence, the silence of a dream that was too big for this world. George Boldt wanted to build a fairy tale, and in a way he did. But it wasn't the fairy tale of happily ever after. It was the original kind of fairy tale, the darker kind, the kind where the magic comes with a terrible price. He built the castle, he built the walls, he built the towers, but the queen never arrived, and the castle waits, perched on its granite throne, watching the river flow by, a beautiful empty shell holding on to a love story that ended before it ever truly began. That is the tragedy and the glory of Boldt Castle.